Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming and welcome. I'm Steve Goldman. I'm the director of the John H. Schnatter Center for Free Enterprise. I want to welcome you to our second event of our three-part series on Asia, from communism to capitalism. We heard last month from Yeonmi Park about the atrocities in North Korea and her experience with human trafficking in China for her and other North Korean escapees. Today, we'll hear from Frank Dikotter about how well the liberation of the Chinese by Mao Zedong and his ideal of property-less society worked out for the people of China. And I'll give you a little heads up, not too well. Our final lecture in the series will be Ning Wang's talk on how China became capitalist. And that will be Monday, November 14th, 4:30, here in the College of Business Auditorium. And he's going to talk about how human flourishing improved when the people in China gained some freedoms to own property and engage in entrepreneurial activity. They're still not free, but they're getting there. As a child, and some of you probably had this experience if you're near my age, my parents would tell me to clean my plate because there were people starving in China. It's like, well, send it to China, right? But I never wondered why, given the abundance of everything we had in the United States, why people would be starving in China. It would have been a really good time for my parents to teach me a lesson. They could have told me that Chinese were starving because their government's policies would not let them own property. They could not trade, which meant they could not flourish. We see similar situations today in North Korea, as Yeonmi Park pointed out, and also in Venezuela today. The shortages of goods in these countries is not because people don't want to work. It's because they do not have a free society. Their governments push socialism, a system that's been shown time and again to fail. An important takeaway from these lectures is to understand that individuals flourish when they have freedom. People act purposely and are best able to determine what makes them best off. As always, I want to thank John and Annette Schnatter for their generous donation to start this center and make these events possible. The mission of the John Schnatter Center is to examine the role of enterprise and entrepreneurship in advancing the well-being of society. This lecture series shows the importance of freedom in advancing this well-being. As always, I strongly encourage you students to major in economics. It's a great major. You can get jobs in a variety of areas: business, government, education, nonprofits. You'll leave school with skill sets that many employers are looking for, and you'll also find the average starting salary is higher than most other majors. It's a good reason to do it. You can either get a BA or a BS. Your BA degree would be like an arts and science degree. You don't have to take any business classes. Or you can get a BS and take the business classes. Either way, you'll be taking economics classes here in the business school, but you can choose either degree. If you're interested, please stop by my office and talk to me or talk to one of your economics professors. Finally, next semester speakers series is going to be examining entrepreneurship. And we have talks by entrepreneurs Bob Luddy and Star Parker and a venture capitalist, Christina Beckhold. So we'll send out information later on this semester and early next semester. And as always, our events end with free pizza, and they're open to the public. Copies of Frank's book today will be available for sale outside the auditorium at the end of his talk, and he'll sign them for you if you want him to. And also, as you leave, if you're getting extra credit, there'll be somebody handing out cards for your extra credit. And of course, there'll be free pizza and water in the back. All right, so today we're fortunate to have with us Frank Dikotter. Among his 10 books, he's the author of The People's Trilogy, a series of books that document the impact of communism on the lives of ordinary people in China, and it's on the basis of new archival material. The first volume, entitled Mao's Great Famine, The History of China's Most Devastating Catastrophe, won the 2011 Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction, Britain's most prestigious book award for nonfiction. The second volume, The Tragedy of Liberation, A History of the Chinese Revolution from 1945 to 1947, was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize in 2014. And his final book in the trilogy is A Cultural Revolution, A People's History, from 1962 to 1976. He's been Chair Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong since 2006. Before that, he was a professor of modern history of China at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. His research and writing has been funded by over $2 million in grants from various foundations, including in Britain, the Wellcome Trust, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and Economic and Social Research Council, and in Hong Kong, the Research Grants Council and Ching Kuo Foundation. His 10 published books have changed the ways historians view modern China, from the classic The Discourse of Race in Modern China to China Before Mao, The Age of Openness. Frank Dikotter is married and lives in Hong Kong. And so we are glad that he traveled all the way here. He actually came from Berlin, but I'm glad he came here to give the talk. So I want to welcome Frank. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I had a stop in Berlin for about 1 week, so I'm only 6 hours ahead of you, which is still past bedtime for me. I want to talk about the tragedy of liberation, 1949 to 1956. These years are often overlooked, and I think that it's probably one of the greatest propaganda pieces of the People's Republic of China to pretend that the 1950s or 60s or 70s, the entire 3 decades of crimes against humanity under Mao Zedong, simply don't really matter. That the China today has nothing to do with the 1950s, that it's a different planet altogether. Yet from 1949 to this very day, the one-party state, the Communist part of China, the structures, organizations, sometimes the very families are the same. In other words, what I'm going to do today is give you a slice of the CV that every entrepreneur dealing with the People's Republic of China should read carefully before starting business. Let me start with an anecdote. This is some 10 years ago. In 2006, I was in China researching another book when I read a newspaper article about Changchun. Changchun is a city to the north of Beijing in a very large region referred to as Manchuria. Construction workers dug up a road. Under about 3 feet of that rich, dense, black Manchurian soil, they found thousands of skeletons closely packed together. Local residents, of course, gathered around the excavation site and thought that these were probably the victims of the Japanese occupation of Manchuria during the Second World War. Apparently, only one elderly man realized that they had just stumbled upon the victims of the civil war between the communists on the one hand and Mao Zedong, and Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists on the other. In 1948, the communists had approached Changchun and had tried to starve the city to death, including a nationalist garrison inside the city walls. Liberation came at a cost. At least 160,000 people died of hunger within 5 months. After the communists managed to conquer that city, these bodies were dumped into mass graves without as much as a headstone. After decades of propaganda about the peaceful liberation of China, very few people actually remember the victims of the Chinese Revolution. Now, in order to understand how we even get to Changchun, we have to step back a little bit in time. No need to go all the way back to 1921, when the Communist Party of China is established. 1945 will be enough. On the 6th of August, as some of you history buffs will know, Hiroshima was erased in a blinding flash of light. 2 days later, Stalin invaded Manchuria. He could do so because the United States of America had provided him with plenty of ammunition to do so. So even in the rush of the Soviets to occupy Berlin before the Allied powers, Stalin managed to keep an army in Siberia which was almost 100-man strong. This army invaded Manchuria, went all the way to Korea, stopped at the 38th parallel. Even after Japan capitulated, the Russians didn't simply disappear. They stayed in Manchuria for months on end. They handed over the countryside to Mao Zedong and his communist guerrilla fighters. The Soviets established 16 military academies, including artillery, aircraft, engineering schools. Some Chinese officers were sent to Moscow for advanced training. And all along, as Stalin and the Soviets were transforming Mao's ragtag army of guerrilla fighters into a formidable fighting machine, with help coming by air, by train, 2,000 wagon loads alone from North Korea allocated to the task, Truman, in September 1946, imposed an arms embargo on Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. But Chiang Kai-shek, rightly or wrongly, depending on one's view, believed that without control of Manchuria, the industrial powerhouse and strategic gateway to China, he could not defend his country. So he kept on pouring his very best troops into Manchuria. Mao was determined to pretty much destroy the nationalists in a ruthless war of attrition, regardless of human cost on either side of this civil war. By 1947, Manchuria had become a death trap. Army after army sent in by Chiang Kai-shek was defeated. In April 1948, the communists finally advanced towards their first major city in Manchuria, Linbiao, a very short, gaunt marshal, realizing that there was a nationalist garrison inside the city walls, decided to starve the city into surrender. He said, turn Changchun into a city of death. He had a soldier every 50 meters along barbed wire, trenches 4 meters deep. Nobody was allowed to leave Changchun, including the civilians. Zhang Zhengrong, at the time, was a lieutenant with the People's Liberation Army. He said, Hiroshima, Changchun, one and the same thing. Changchun took 9 seconds. Hiroshima took 9 seconds. Changchun took 5 months. The number of victims was pretty much the same, over 160,000. Of course, Changchun wasn't the only city encircled by the communists. Other cities were besieged when finally, by the end of 1949, there were communist troops massed outside the gates of Beijing. That city surrendered. Like dominoes, other cities fell one after the other. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists had to flee to Taiwan, which to this day, of course, remains separate from the People's Republic of China. What happened once the red flag went up over the forbidden city in Beijing? Well, liberation in the cities started with a fanfare, a very carefully choreographed procession with soldiers opening the parade, a lorry carrying a large portrait of Chairman Mao, and of course dancers waving big red flags, swinging their bodies to the music played by heavy waist drums, trumpets, gongs. We don't know what onlookers thought, but many of them must have viewed this with some apprehension, but also hope. Hope that at long last they would be able to just get on with their lives. The police followed very soon afterwards. They were not so friendly. In fact, the regime was confronted with a new problem. It had to run this gigantic country, but didn't have enough people to do the task. So they asked former government employees, including policemen, to stay on their jobs. In return, of course, for security and possibly even gratitude. So the police did the rounds. They invited themselves into the homes of ordinary people, looking for forbidden weapons, radios, guns. But they did something else. They gave every single person in these cities a class label, a so-called 称番, which was based on the background and personal history of every single person. There were three classes, so-called good classes: revolutionary soldiers, factory workers. Intellectuals were generally assigned to the so-called middle classes. And then there were bad classes, seen as capitalists, landlords, traitors. Regardless, all of them had to go back to school, from Changchun all the way in the north, down to Guangzhou in the south. Cities became giant adult education centers. People had to learn the new orthodoxy, read the works of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. They were asked to transform themselves into new people. They were reasonably well off, but not so people the party viewed as a drain on its financial resources and a threat to social stability. Beggars, paupers, prostitutes, pickpockets, and of course millions of disbanded soldiers and refugees. In batch after batch, these people were dumped in the countryside. The countryside became the dumping ground for all undesirable elements. They were not the only ones to disappear. The moment the bamboo curtain came down, foreigners left in droves. We tend to forget that Shanghai alone, not to mention other cities, was twice as big as Moscow, had a larger foreign population than any city on planet Earth except New York, and had more foreign investment than either Paris or London. Within months, most foreigners were gone. A curfew was imposed at 6 in the evening. Nightclubs were closed down. Dance halls made into factories. Unemployment rocketed. Bustling Shanghai was a dying city. Similar scenario for other cities. But what about the countryside? The one single most important act that came with liberation was something referred to as land reform. It started in the countryside in Manchuria well before liberation in 1947. It was carried out in every village all the way down to Hainan Island in the south by 1952. In some places, people had to go through land reform twice. Let me focus on one small village to the north of Changchun called Yuanbao, where land reform was carried out in 1947. A similar scenario would repeat itself endlessly elsewhere. A work team was sent to that village. They spent months trying to find out what the power structure was among these 700 villages. But they did more than that. They did more than just identify who had a certain voice. They tried to dig up old grudges. They tried to fan resentment into something much larger called class hatred. They tried to destroy a closely knit village and polarize it into a majority against a small number of targets. After a couple of months, soldiers came, blocked off the village. A number of targets were dragged onto a stage very much like this one. People denounced as landlords, traitors, renegades. And the villagers assembled in their hundreds had to denounce them, screaming, shouting for justice, beating them up, humiliating them, beating to death a good 76 people out of this village of 700. The assets of these victims were distributed to the other villages. What happened, in effect, is that Mao pitted people against each other. Mao made sure that a majority of people were compelled to take part in a crime. He made sure that there would be no return to the old order, as everybody had blood on their hands and everybody had benefited from this crime, with assets being redistributed. In short, the pact between the poor and the party was written in blood. A sufficient quantity of blood had to be shed to make sure nobody wanted to go back to the old order. Some of the poorest got most of the land. Their sons joined the People's Liberation Army. These were the soldiers who would camp outside of Changchun, starving that city into death. How many? It's hard to say. How many people were expropriated? Probably about 10 million. 40% of the land changed hands between 1947 and 1952. Probably close to 2 million people were literally beaten to death for being enemies of the regime. In some cases, even small children denounced as little landlords. Now, you might think that after land reform, there would be an era of peace and stability. It was not to happen. On the 18th of October, 1950, a year after the flag went up in Beijing, some 200,000 troops crossed the border into Korea under the cover of night. A couple of weeks later, they attacked United Nations troops in Korea. Mao had just joined the Korean War. And Mao used war to increase tension at home. From October 1950 to October 1951, there would be a campaign of terror in the People's Republic of China. Already before the 18th of October, precisely 66 years ago, on the 10th of October, traditionally celebrated by the nationalist regime as its national day, Mao had mandated that all enemies standing in the way of revolution, spies, bandits, traitors, be eliminated. Who precisely were these enemies? Well, of course, the regime was paranoid, seeing enemies everywhere. When there was a well that was poisoned or a granary that went up in flames, local cadres, local party officials somehow imagined that there was the hand of a landlord or a spy from Taiwan behind it. And of course, the regime also used this campaign of terror to justify increasingly drastic forms of policing. But the beauty of the archives that I used to do the research for this book is that it shows that across the People's Republic, opposition to the new regime started right away in 1949. In eastern China, some 40 rebellions over the summer of 1950 alone. In Guizhou, a subtropical province covered in dense vegetation with karst mountains, up to a third of young people took to the mountains in order to fight the communists. In a place like Nanxian, up to 10,000 irate farmers surrounded the county seat of the party. There was a lot of rebellion going on. But precisely how many people should be eliminated during this campaign of terror? That really was the question. There was a man in Beijing in charge of public security. His name was Luo Ruiqing. He had a large portrait of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the architect of the Soviet Cheka, on his wall right behind his desk. But he could not possibly oversee the arrest, the trial, and judgment of the many millions who were targeted by the terror. So what happened instead is that death, very much like steel output or grain production, came with a quota. Mao believed that 1 per 1,000 was a reasonable killing rate. 1 per 1,000. But of course, before you know it, people, villages, counties, entire provinces start vying to outdo each other. These are hard revolutionaries, and they are determined to show how hard they are. Already by the middle of 1951, in the province of Guizhou, the killing target has reached 3 per 1,000. Let me give you a couple of examples of people who become victims of this national witch hunt. In Yanxing, a very rich county in Yunnan, also in the south, covered in salt marshes, over 100 school children were arrested. One boy, called Wu Lianing, aged 10, was hung from a beam and beaten. Another one, called Ma Silie, aged 8, had his legs and knees crushed on the concrete floor. 2 of these students were tortured to death. A 6-year-old was accused of being the head of a spying squad operating on behalf of Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. Now, you might think that I've picked an extreme example, but there are many in the archives. Across the border from Hong Kong, where I live and work, is Guangdong province, and there's a place called Luoding. Some 340 students, primary school students, were investigated on the basis of an anonymous report about an alleged case of theft. In fact, across that province, up to 1/3 of all victims were innocent, even by the standards of the regime at the time. But something else was happening. These executions were meant to reflect the wrath of the people. Riots, gangsters were executed in public. People were compelled to attend these executions. In cities, students like yourselves would have to go to the stadium to watch. In villages, people were assembled around the stage to watch and cheer. But something else was happening. A lot of these local party officials actually used the campaign to quietly, secretly get rid of their own enemies. Across the province of Sichuan, entire villages were erased without anybody in the higher echelons of power being told about it. In a place like Mogong, 10 people were officially executed for being tribes. Over 170 were covertly assassinated. It's difficult to know how many people were killed, precisely because of the fact that some of these killings were carried out in secret. Nonetheless, Lo Reiqing, the man I mentioned earlier on, got a report from his bean counters telling him that 301,800 people had been killed by the end of 1951 in 6 provinces. China at the time had well over 20. A more reliable estimate comes from a powerful Minister of Finance, Bo Yibo, who declared that up to 2 million people had probably been eliminated during that one single year. This was not the end of it. Even before this campaign of terror peters out, something else happens. Mao wants to purify the ranks of the party and starts a campaign against corruption. The high point comes in February 1952, a very cold, wintry day in Hebei, when 2 high-ranking officials are executed in the Baoding Stadium. As a concession to their rank, they are shot in the heart rather than in the head. This trial sends shockwaves through the ranks of the party. Bo Yibo, the finance minister I just mentioned, papa of Bo Xilai, the man recently put on trial by Xi Jinping, declares that at least 10,000 high-ranking communists are corrupt. Xi Zhongxun, papa of Xi Jinping, the man in power today, is head of the Northwest and declares that there are at least 300,000 cases of corruption among party members in his region. But as with the recent campaign against corruption, under the cover of popular support, something else is happening. In 1949, these former government employees and policemen were asked to stay on and help the new regime. By now, 1952, the Communist Party has trained a sufficient number of new cadres to take over. Old employees are no longer needed. 1 million of them are sacked, many of them sent to the Gulag. Still, not the end of this campaign either. Corruption inside the ranks of the party is one thing, but who precisely has corrupted all these Communist Party members? Mao thinks about it very carefully, and on the 5th of January 1952 shifts this campaign towards another target by declaring that the bourgeoisie is responsible for this corruption. Mao declares war on private enterprise. Of course, many entrepreneurs had been promised protection by the new regime in 1949. But now they have to appear on stages just like landlords in the countryside had to appear on stages during land reform. Small shopkeepers, entrepreneurs, powerful industrialists, all of them are denounced by their workers. Sometimes they turn against each other to save themselves, denounce each other. In Beijing, a mere 1 out of 5 so-called capitalists are seen to be reliable. All of them are persecuted. How many died? It's difficult to say, but in a city like Shanghai, in the space of 3 months, some 644 people commit suicide. Now, you might think that that's only about 10 a day, but it's not that easy. All these entrepreneurs are being supervised by the people, frequently locked up into their own offices till they've written long confessions. So committing suicide is not all that easy. On top of that, you can't simply open the window and jump. That's because so many people by now have committed suicide that the police has erected nets that jut out from the first floor to catch potential candidates for death. So what you have to do is find a skyscraper, go all the way to the top, have a flat roof, and then take a running jump to make sure that you really land on that hard concrete that will end your misery. 644 people in 3 months. Now, I'm only in 1952, and I promised you I would take the story all the way till 1957. I will cover the following 4 years by referring to 2 events that occurred in Moscow. The first one happened in March 1953. And again, I know some of you history buffs know what happened. Stalin, of course, died. Stalin is gone. Mao feels liberated. The only one person on planet Earth who could restrain Mao Zedong was Joseph Stalin. Stalin told Mao in 1949, try to include as many people as possible into a united front. Mao wasn't really convinced. Stalin tried to tell Mao, go easy on so-called rich peasants and landlords with land reform. You will need them. Mao didn't really listen. In 1953, months before dying, Stalin had asked Mao to slow down the pace of collectivization. The moment Stalin died, Mao cranked up the pace of collectivization. By the end of the year, he imposes a monopoly on grain. This may sound rather theoretical. What does it actually mean? It means that the vast majority of the people in the countryside who produce crops like potatoes, wheat, corn, rice, must deliver all of it to the state at state-mandated prices to state agents. In other words, they lose control over their crop. They're allowed to retain for themselves and their families a certain amount for their own subsistence, which is determined by the state. And that level is so low that in effect, the entire countryside is put on a starvation diet. Now, when people in the countryside are faced with starvation, they use their legs, they start walking, they look for opportunities elsewhere. This is what happens when a devastating famine appears in China in 1954. But in 1955, this basic freedom of movement comes to an end when Zhou Enlai, Premier number 3, introduces the equivalent of the Soviet internal passport to the countryside, meaning that nobody can move without the consent of a local cadre. That very same year, people are herded into state farms copied from the Soviet Union. These state farms take back the land that was distributed in 1949. These state farms turned villagers into bonded servants at the beck and call of local cadres who tell people what they should do, how they should do it, for how many work points. They are literally bonded servants. Enterprise and industry in 1956 also become functions of the state. You see photos, very interesting, of people, industrialists, shopkeepers, who appear to be very enthusiastic. They want to hand over their assets to the state. Please, have the shop I've been working on for 2 generations. Have the industry I spent a lifetime setting up. Why are they so desperate, or so keen, one should say? Because if they don't show sufficient enthusiasm, they won't get a job. If they're lucky enough, they might be retained as an employee in the very enterprises they set up themselves. This is 1956. Now, this causes widespread resentment. How do we know? Because of a second event triggered by Moscow. This one happens on the 25th of February 1956. when Nikita Khrushchev, party secretary and leader of the Soviet Union, turns against his erstwhile master Stalin and denounces him, detailing the horrors of terror under Stalin, denouncing the cult of personality. It's the start of de-Stalinization. Mao sees it as an attack on his own person. He, after all, is the Stalin of China. And of course, a number of his colleagues, including Zhou Enlai, start using Khrushchev's secret speech to slow down the pace of collectivization in China. They too criticize the cult of personality. It takes Mao 2 months to respond. On the 25th of April, he gives a long speech to assembled party comrades, a speech entitled On the 10 Relationships. Now, fear not, I'm not going to recite this speech, it's a very boring one. But in a nutshell, Mao poses as a champion of ordinary people. In order to reclaim moral leadership over the party, he becomes a protector of democratic values. He actually outdoes Khrushchev. 2 months earlier, Mao looked like a dictator clinging on to an outdated model. Now, he is the one who strikes a far more liberal tone than his counterpart in Moscow. He asks his own party to accept that 100 flowers bloom, 100 schools contend. This is the start of the so-called movement of the 100 flowers. And content people do. Workers go on strike. Students organize demonstrations in the streets. We'll never know precisely how many cases there were, but in a small city like Xi'an in Shanxi, up to 40 cases of strikes and demonstrations by ordinary people are recorded. Far more than in the days of so-called capitalist exploitation of the 1930s. And farmers too have had enough. In Guangdong province, up to 1/3 of the villagers take back their own tools, take back what they think is their own cattle, leave the collectors, beat up any carter who stands in their way. Still, most intellectuals remain rather prudent, and for good reason. They've been subjected to one campaign of thought reform after the other since 1949. In February, Mao eggs them on, telling them that he will guarantee their protection. Now, students and intellectuals start speaking out, but they don't quite say what Mao had in mind. Instead of praising him, as Mao had hoped, they criticize the Communist Party. They talk about democracy. They want the communists to stand out. They want to vote. They compare Mao to the Pope. Mao is badly miscalculated. He turns around, puts a small, nasty little man called Deng Xiaoping in charge of a campaign against so-called rightists. Rightists are people who have anti-communist views. Deng Xiaoping ships away about 500,000 people to the great northern wilderness, most of it in Manchuria. In other words, the Gulag. So by the end of 1957, pretty much every basic freedom has been crushed. The freedom of expression, right away. Freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom to trade. All of these basic freedoms have been crushed. Every promise made by Mao has disappeared. Like Lenin and the Bolsheviks in 1917, Mao also came to power by making promises to each separate group. Land for the villages, protection of private property for entrepreneurs, better working conditions for workers, independence for ethnic minorities like the Tibetans. Every promise here has been crushed. by the end of 1957, there are no critics left. The party rallies behind Mao, afraid of all the demonstrations that just took place. Mao is now ready to start a whole new experiment in communism. He calls it a great leap forward. That's the story for another day. Thank you.
We have time for questions. There's some microphones in the back. If you have a question, go up to the microphone and please ask.
I can.
Hello. Yeah, you probably can tell. Well, I grew up in China, and by the time right now, I probably heard this story for like over and over again for at least 20 different versions, not including novels and movies. If counting novels and movies, and TV episode probably have 100 different versions. And so my question to you is, at some point, to our generation, we say, if there's no picture, no truth. Or at some point, we are looking for some evidence to say no evidence, no truth. Is it possible you can show us some of your research or some of the pictures, evidence you have, to show this is the study you have done and not clouded by some of the 100 different versions of the movies or episode you had from China. And there's a huge industry just making movies, TV episode, or giving talks like you're doing. And they're doing that for many, many years.
Well, if you're really talking about movies made in the People's Republic of China, then I very much doubt that there are 100 versions. There's one version, and that's the official version. The official version is that liberation was wonderful. And China finally stood up. And the country thrived. It was the golden age. That's the version you will get in those 100 movies you can see in the People's Republic of China. But the question of evidence is a very good one. Certainly not in pictures. God knows how many photos have been manipulated since 1949. As in, of course, any other dictatorship. Under Stalin, sometimes you have his enemy appear right next to him, and the next day he's gone. In Romania, Ceausescu is not just people being taken out of photos, it's Ceausescu being added to meetings he never attended. He appears to be everywhere, so you can't rely on photos. Surely, the evidence is inside the archives of the Communist Party of China itself. There are extraordinarily detailed reports in city archives, in county archives, in provincial archives, in the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other central archives. A mountain of material that includes police reports about rebellions in the countryside.
Can you show us some you have?
Yeah, it's in the book. They're called footnotes. Some people say there are too many footnotes. The footnotes refer to some 20 provincial archives. There's a mountain of documentation. What you have to understand is all dictatorships live in a culture of secrecy. A culture of secrecy doesn't mean that there is no material. It's precisely the opposite. People keep notes on everything, every meeting, every little purge, every little investigation there is a note. So there's a mountain of statistics on the number of people executed. When I mentioned the figure of 301,800 victims, that's a report written to Law Reiching, which is based on compilation by a whole department of statistics. All of this is, of course, secret. There's secret speeches, secret reports. There's endless material. And all of it points towards a very basic truth, that liberation really was calculated terror and systematic violence, along with broken promises.
Any other questions? It's getting late. This will be the last one.
Good afternoon, sir. As you talked about earlier, into promises to each group, we see a romantic looking involvement with socialism, communism, and things of that nature in this country. And we know that there's a communist infiltration of FDR's cabinet. There's definitely, between that kind of through McCarthy era, how do we see aspects of communist China and Soviet Union? What sort of aspects are we seeing in the United States today?
Well, I'd love to answer that one, but I'm not a student of the United States. I'm a student of the People's Republic of China, and of course I'm a historian, so I really don't study the present. There's one thing I can tell you, is that there's a theme that runs throughout the United States from the Second World War to this day. Of course, the State Department at the time, in the aftermath of the Second World War, proposed a vision of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China, which was rather romantic. In other words, the communists were described as agrarian reformers, people like you and me, well-meaning, well-intentioned people from China who had nothing to do with Stalin and Stalinism. That idea that somehow communism in China isn't really communism is something that you can somehow still read about to this very day. It's amazing the number of people who seem surprised when you tell them that the People's Republic of China today is a communist country. They seem to say, oh, but it's not really communist. There's no communist ideology. People have basic freedoms. Hundreds of millions of people have been pulled out of poverty. But as I said in the beginning, the very structures of the one-party state, the very Communist Party itself, the very families from Bo Yibo to Bo Xilai and Xi Zhongxun to Xi Jinping are very much the same. It remains very much a one-party state regime. So the idea that somehow China is something else, that is somehow a nation of entrepreneurs, or a nation of capitalists, or a nation of agrarian reformers, I think is deeply misguided. That's about it.
All right, we're out of time. I'm sorry. There's pizza in the back, and I want to thank Frank for coming. It's been a really interesting lecture. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. My trophies.
Quick question. I remember visiting Beijing about 10 or 15 years ago. We had an MBA program that I taught in Hong Kong, and as a side trip,